The far north holds a particular kind of silence, not emptiness, but a hush so deep that even the wind seems to move with caution. One winter night, a Sámi herder stepped from the warmth of his lavu, reindeer hide tent, into the dark. No sunrise had visited the horizon in weeks. The snow beneath his boots absorbed every sound, and even the stars seemed too distant to offer guidance. Yet he could travel miles confidently, guided only by the muffled grunt of his reindeer and an internal map, a memory of frozen rivers, hidden valleys, and safe forest lines. If that sound was lost, he would be too. In this land, losing direction was not frightening, only final. Survival here was quiet rather than heroic. There were no dramatic battles against the cold, only a constant, steady dialogue with it. A discipline of listening. A rhythm measured not by clocks but by reindeer migrations, shifting ice, and the way snow changed underfoot. What does it mean to live where the sun barely rises for months? Where twilight feels like morning, afternoon, and nearly night all at once? How do you find your way when every direction looks the same? White, silent, endless. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, imagine walking into that darkness. The cold presses close, not as an enemy, but as a familiar presence. The Sámi didn't try to conquer winter. They survived by moving with it, adjusting to its quiet demands rather than resisting them. If these slow journeys into the past bring you rest, you're welcome to subscribe to Epic Boring History, where thousands gather to drift through quiet stories like this one. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from, and the time there, so we can imagine our small constellation of lights across the world. For now, let the modern world fade. Let your breath lengthen into the measured pace of footsteps through deep snow. We are heading north, to a place where the wind speaks in low whispers and survival is built from small, repeated acts. Mending a harness, boiling snow for water, drawing warmth from a fire before the darkness presses in again. The Sámi lived here for thousands of years. Their story is not one of conquest, but of something more enduring. The quiet courage of continuing. Let us begin where every Sámi winter morning began, in darkness, in cold, in the moment just before you leave the warmth of reindeer furs and step outside into a world blue and silent. You wake in darkness, though whether it is night or merely the dim grey that passes for day here, you cannot immediately tell. The distinction matters less than you might think. Beneath you, reindeer hides provide a cushion against the frozen ground, and above you more hides are piled, their weight familiar, their warmth precious. The moment you shift, cold air finds the gaps in your covering, and you feel the heat leaving your body like water, draining from a vessel. The lavu, the tent that has been your home for these winter months, is dark except for the faint glow of embers at its center. Someone fed the fire during the night, a small mercy that means the air inside is cold rather than killing. You can hear breathing around you, family members still sleeping or pretending to sleep, reluctant to be the first to face the day's demands. Outside, the wind makes a sound like distant conversation, though you have learned not to listen too carefully to what the wind seems to say. Your first task is simple. You must dress, but dressing in winter is not the casual act it might be in gentler climates. You begin with the innermost layer, reindeer skin worn with the fur against your flesh. The hide is soft from use, shaped to your body through countless wearings, and it smells of smoke and sweat and animal fat, scents so familiar they have become part of your own smell. Over this goes another layer, fur facing outward this time, and then another, each piece carefully positioned and tied with sinew cord that your fingers know by feel in the darkness. Your hands move with practiced efficiency, but even so the cold finds them. Every motion must be deliberate. A carelessly tied cord means a gap where wind can enter, and wind is the enemy that never sleeps, never tires, never shows mercy to the unprepared. The final layer is your outer coat, thick reindeer hide, decorated with simple patterns in colored thread, markings that identify you to others, that speak of your family and your place in the intricate web of relationships that holds your people together. You pull on boots lined with dried grass that you harvested yourself in the brief summer, and that must be changed daily to prevent dampness from freezing your toes. On your head goes a cap that covers your ears, and around your hands mittens that will grow stiff with frost before the day is through. You are armored now, encased in layers that transform you into something bulkier, slower, more bare than human. The air inside the lavu, which seemed cold when you woke, now feels almost warm against your covered face. You know this is an illusion. You move toward the entrance, a flap of hide that must be lifted carefully to prevent snow from tumbling inside. The person who exits carelessly brings the weather with them and earns quiet disapproval that can last for days. Outside, the world has been reduced to its essential elements: white ground, dark sky, the shapes of other lavas barely visible through the dim light, and gently falling snow. The air enters your lungs like something solid, and your first breath makes you cough, a sound quickly muffled by the snow that absorbs everything. The landscape stretches away in all directions, without feature or landmark. Snow has filled in every depression, covered every stone, transformed the world into an empty page. You have been living in this camp for 2 weeks, and already you are thinking of moving. The reindeer have eaten the visible moss and must dig deeper now, pouring through snow to reach the lichens beneath, and when they must work too hard for food, they grow thin and weak. But moving in winter is a calculation of risk against necessity. You must pack everything: tents, tools, food stores, children, the elderly, onto sleds and drive the herd to new grazing, hoping the weather holds, hoping you have chosen the right direction, hoping the snow is not too deep for the reindeer to pull their loads. These decisions are made collectively, with quiet discussions that can last for days. You are not important enough to have your voice heard in such councils, but you will bear the consequences of whatever is decided. For now, your task is simpler. You must check the reindeer. The herd is settled in a shallow valley where the hills provide some shelter from wind and where the dogs can keep watch more easily. You walk toward them, and each step is an effort. The snow is deep enough that you sink with every stride, and you must lift your feet high, pushing through resistance that never eases. Your breathing becomes rhythmic. Step, sink, lift, step, sink, lift. And you feel sweat beginning to form beneath your layers despite the cold. This is dangerous. Sweat that freezes will steal your warmth faster than any wind. The reindeer appear as shapes in the falling snow, grey and brown forms that move slowly, heads down, pawing at the ground. They do not acknowledge your approach, though they know you are there. These animals are your wealth, your food, your clothing, your transportation, your fuel when their dung is collected and dried. Without them, you would not survive a single winter in this place. You count them by habit, though you know the number well. 63 animals belong to your family group, a number that seems substantial, but that represents a year's worth of careful management, of protecting calves from predators, of guiding the herd away from dangerous river crossings, of rationing which animals can be slaughtered for meat and which must be preserved for breeding. One of the dogs, a lean, pale creature with eyes like chips of ice, watches you from the edge of the herd. The dogs are not pets, they are workers whose partnership is essential but never warm. You check for injuries, for signs of sickness, for any animal that seems weaker than it should. Reindeer hide suffering well, and by the time a problem is obvious, it is often too late to save the animal. All seems well today, which means only that no catastrophe has occurred yet. In winter, you learn to measure success in the absence of disaster rather than in the presence of triumph. You return to camp, and now the light, such as it is, has strengthened slightly. You can see the other members of your group emerging from tents, moving with the same slow deliberation, faces hidden behind scarves and hoods. No one calls out greetings. Speech requires energy, and energy must be conserved. At the central tent, smoke rises from the opening at its peak, a sign that the communal fire has been rebuilt. You make your way there, brushing snow from your clothes before entering. Inside, several people are already gathered, sitting in a circle around the fire, hands extended toward its meager warmth. The fire is small, fuel is precious, and a large fire would consume your supply too quickly, but even this modest flame is a comfort. Someone passes you a wooden bowl containing boiled meat. The meat is from a reindeer slaughtered 3 days ago, and by now it tastes of little but salt and fat, the subtle flavors cooked away by repeated boiling. You eat slowly, methodically, chewing each piece thoroughly. Food is not about taste here, it is about fuel, about putting calories into your body that will be converted to warmth, to motion, to the energy required to survive another day. The fat is the best part. You can feel it coating your mouth, feel your body recognizing it as valuable as necessary. Fat insulates, fat burns slowly, fat keeps you alive when thin people fail. Around the fire, conversation is minimal. Someone mentions that the wind is shifting, coming now from the north rather than the west. This is noted without comment, though everyone understands its implications. Northern wind is colder, brings heavier snow, makes life harder. After eating, you have work to do. There is always work. Today's task is to scrape a reindeer hide that has been soaking in snow for days, softening it enough to be worked. You carry the stiff hide to a flat stone and begin the slow, repetitive process of removing the membrane and fat from its inner surface. The scraping tool is made from sharpened bone, worn smooth by generations of hands before yours. Your fingers grip it tightly, though they are already beginning to lose feeling despite your mittens. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The motion is hypnotic, endless, mind-numbing. Your shoulders ache within the first hour, but you cannot stop. This hide will become clothing, perhaps for a child whose old garments have grown too small, or perhaps for trade with another group, exchanged for iron tools or salt or other necessities you cannot produce yourselves. Every few minutes you must stop to warm your hands at a small fire you have built nearby. The warming is never complete. The cold lives in your bones now, a permanent resident that can only be temporarily pushed back, never truly expelled. Other people work nearby, a woman stitching sinew thread through leather with movements so practiced she hardly needs to look, a man repairing a sled runner that cracked during the last move, a young person braiding rope from dried willow bark. No one speaks unless necessary. The day passes in this slow accumulation of small tasks. There are no dramatic moments, no crises, only the steady, patient work of maintaining life in a place that offers no forgiveness for laziness or mistake. As the dim light begins to fade, evening arriving indistinguishably from afternoon, you return to your lavu. Your hands are raw despite your care, your shoulders tight with fatigue, your face numb from wind that never stopped blowing. Inside, someone has rebuilt the fire. You settle into your place, grateful for the hide cushions beneath you, for the shelter of the tent around you, for the presence of others who share this existence. Food is prepared. More boiled meat, some dried fish that tastes of smoke and salt, a handful of berries saved from autumn that have frozen and thawed so many times they have become soft and dark and almost formless, but are nevertheless treasured for the small variation they offer from the monotony of meat. After eating, there is little to do but rest. You cannot work in darkness without wasting precious lamp oil, and most tasks require light. Stories are told sometimes in the old language that carries the weight of centuries, stories of ancestors who lived through harder winters, who survived famines that killed half their group, who saw the sun disappear completely for months and yet continued. These stories are not exciting. There are no heroes, no villains, only people who endured or did not endure, who made good choices or poor ones, who were lucky or unlucky in ways that had nothing to do with their virtue or strength. Tonight, no one tells stories. The silence is complete, except for the fire's crackling and the wind's constant voice outside. You think about tomorrow, which will be the same as today. You will wake in darkness, dress in layers, check the reindeer, eat, work, rest, sleep. The day after will be identical, and the day after that. This is the truth of winter in the far north. It is not a series of adventures or challenges to overcome, but rather a long, slow test of patience, of your ability to repeat the same tasks day after day without hope of variety, to endure discomfort without complaint, to accept that life here is measured not in joy or fulfillment, but simply in continuation. You sleep, and in your sleep you are walking through snow. You are always walking through snow in your dreams now, though sometimes the snow is falling upward instead of down, or the reindeer are speaking in human voices, or the auroras are singing words you almost understand. The boundaries between waking and sleeping grow thin in deep winter. Life becomes dreamlike, each day bleeding into the next without distinction, time losing its meaning when there is no sun to mark its passage. You wake again, or perhaps you never truly slept, and the cycle begins once more. Darkness, cold, dressing, work, food, rest, darkness again. This is your life. This is everyone's life here, not for days or weeks, but for months that stretch into a season that feels like it will never end. And yet somehow it does end. Winter always ends, though in the depths of January or February, when the darkness is deepest and the cold most severe, it is difficult to remember this truth, difficult to believe that warmth and light will ever return. But belief is not required for survival. Only endurance is required, only the stubborn, quiet refusal to surrender to the cold, to keep moving, keep working, keep eating, keep sleeping, keep waking to face another identical day. The Sámi have done this for thousands of years. You are doing it now. Your children will do it after you. This is not heroism. This is simply life reduced to its most essential form, the will to continue when continuation requires everything you have and offers nothing in return except the promise of another day exactly like this one. Your hands scrape the hide, your feet walk through snow, your body endures the cold, your mind grows quiet, patient, empty of everything except the immediate task, the next step, the small flame that must be kept alive through the long, patient darkness. Winter teaches one lesson above all others. You are small, the world is vast and cold and indifferent, and your only power is the choice to continue or to stop. Everything else is beyond your control. You choose to continue. Everyone here makes this choice day after day, not because they are brave or strong or special, but simply because stopping means death. And despite everything, despite the cold and the darkness and the endless repetition, some deep instinct insists that continuing is better. So you continue. The snow falls, the wind blows, the reindeer paw at the frozen ground. The days pass like beads on a string, each one indistinguishable from the last, and somewhere deep inside, so deep you are hardly aware of it, you carry the knowledge that spring will come, the sun will return, the snow will melt, the reindeer will grow fat on fresh grass, life will feel different, lighter, warmer. But that time is not now. Now is winter, and winter demands only one thing: that you endure it, quietly, patiently, without complaint or hope, simply moving through each moment as it comes, one breath, one step, one day at a time. This is why it sucked to be you here, now in the deep winter of the far north. Not because of any single hardship or suffering, but because of the accumulation of small discomforts repeated endlessly, the grinding down of your spirit by cold and darkness and monotony, until you become as patient and enduring as the stones themselves, until you forget what it felt like to be warm, to be comfortable, to live without the constant background awareness of your body's vulnerability to the indifferent cruelty of your environment. Or you are tough now in ways you never knew you could be. But toughness is not the same as happiness, and survival is not the same as living well. You survive, that is all. That is everything. That is enough because it must be enough. The snow continues to fall, soft and silent and endless, covering everything, erasing everything, reducing the world to white and grey, and the small circle of warmth you defend against the patient, waiting cold. There was a man whose life moved with the reindeer, whose story unfolded not in dramatic events, but in the slow accumulation of seasons, of migrations repeated, of choices made quietly in consultation with land and weather, and the animals whose rhythms determined everything. His name, in the language his people spoke, meant something like one who reads the crossing, or perhaps he who knows the ford, though translation always loses more than it captures. Let us call him Reindeer Andai, and let us follow his life from birth to death, not because he was extraordinary, he was not, but because his very ordinariness makes him typical of the people who lived this way, whose names are forgotten, but whose choices shaped the survival of their communities through centuries of patient endurance. To understand one life lived fully in this manner is to understand something essential about human existence that has been largely erased by modernity, by the belief that only the exceptional matters, that only those who stand above their communities deserve remembering. Andai was born during a spring snowstorm when the group was moving from winter grounds toward the coast, following the reindeer toward summer pastures where the animals would calve and fatten on fresh growth. His mother felt the contractions while riding a sled, and the group stopped only briefly for the birth before continuing, because timing mattered more than comfort, and a delay of even a day could mean arriving at the calving grounds too late, finding them already claimed by another group facing conflict or the need to turn back. The old women who attended his birth noted that he emerged quickly without fuss and interpreted this as a sign of good fortune, a child who understood intuitively that life here required efficiency, that nature granted no extra time for ceremony or difficulty. Whether this interpretation had any truth to it, or whether it simply reflected the human need to find meaning in random events, Andai's life would ultimately bear out their prediction, though perhaps not in ways that could have been foreseen in those first moments when he entered the world, squalling briefly before falling silent, as if already learning the value of conserving energy. His early years passed in the rhythm common to all Sámi children, summers of relative ease when food was plentiful and the endless daylight allowed for play, winters of enforced stillness when even children understood the necessity of conserving energy, of staying close to fires, of not wandering beyond sight of the tents where you could become lost in snow and darkness. The contrast between these seasons was so absolute that it seemed like living two different lives, alternating between them in a pattern that had repeated for countless generations, each child learning anew what their ancestors had always known. He learned by watching more than by instruction. His father, whose name has not survived in memory, was a quiet man who spoke rarely, but whose actions demonstrated the accumulated knowledge of generations: how to read snow conditions, how to predict weather from the behavior of animals and the appearance of clouds, how to judge the timing of migrations with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, but was really just careful attention paid over decades. Andai absorbed these lessons without being conscious of learning. He watched his father examine moss conditions to determine whether the reindeer would find adequate grazing, saw how the old man would kneel and brush away snow to check the lichen beneath, how he would taste it sometimes to gauge its moisture content, how he would nod or frown based on what he found, these small gestures containing entire arguments about whether to stay or move, whether the herd would thrive or starve. By the time Andai was 7 or 8, age was measured more by capability than by counting years. He was trusted to manage small tasks alone. He could collect water from streams, taking care to break ice properly so it would reform cleanly, build and maintain fires with the careful arrangement of wood that ensured steady heat without waste, set snares for small game in places where tracks indicated regular passage, recognize the signs of an animal in distress by the way it held itself apart from the herd or made sounds that others ignored. But it was in reading the land that his particular gift emerged. Where others saw only snow, Andai noticed subtle variations in texture and depth that indicated what lay beneath. Whether rock or soft ground, whether water that might crack under weight, or solid earth that would support a sled's passage, whether drifts that concealed danger, or merely the natural accumulation of a season's snowfall arranged by wind into deceptive shapes. Where others saw forest, he observed the spacing of trees that revealed old paths, natural routes that the reindeer had followed for generations because they offered the most efficient passage. These routes were not marked or maintained, yet they persisted year after year because they represented the land's own logic, the paths of least resistance that countless hooves had discovered and rediscovered, wearing grooves not in the earth but in the collective memory of the herds. His father noticed this ability, though he never praised it directly. Praise could make a child arrogant, and arrogance was dangerous in a place where overconfidence could lead to death, where a young man who thought too highly of his judgment might take risks that would end not just his life, but the lives of those who depended on him. Instead, he began to position Andai at the front of their group during migrations, allowing the boy to suggest directions while retaining the authority to overrule if necessary. This was how responsibility was transferred in Sámi culture, not through formal ceremonies or announcements, but through gradual inclusion, through the slow accumulation of trust demonstrated in small decisions that built toward larger ones. Ant learned that leadership was not about commanding, but about suggesting, that his observations were valuable only if others chose to accept them, that the moment he became insistent rather than humble, his influence would evaporate. He learned to phrase his ideas carefully, to say, perhaps we might consider rather than we should, to acknowledge uncertainty even when he felt sure, because certainty itself was a kind of blindness that prevented learning from mistakes. The first true test of his abilities came during his 13th winter, when the group faced a common but potentially fatal problem. The reindeer needed to cross a frozen river to reach better grazing, but the ice was of uncertain thickness, and a herd breaking through ice could mean the loss of animals, supplies, even lives. The river was wide here, the current strong beneath the surface, and everyone knew stories of entire groups losing most of their herd to a crossing gone wrong, left destitute and forced to merge with other families, their independence ended by a single miscalculation. The adults debated for a day, unable to reach consensus. Some argued for waiting until the cold deepened and the ice thickened further, pointing out that the season was young and patience might save lives, while others insisted that delay meant the herd would starve before reaching the far side, that the animals were already showing signs of hunger and could not afford to wait for perfect conditions that might never arrive. Andai said nothing during these discussions, but he walked the river's edge alone, examining the ice carefully. He looked at the color. White ice was air-trapped and weak, likely to shatter under weight. Blue ice was dense and strong, having formed slowly in stable cold that compressed the water into something solid and reliable. He looked at cracks and their patterns, understanding that some cracks were merely surface phenomena, the ice's response to temperature changes, while others indicated deeper structural problems. He listened to the sound the ice made when he stamped on it near the shore, hearing how the noise traveled, whether it was sharp and clear or dull and muffled, each quality revealing something about what lay beneath his feet. Finally, he approached his father and spoke quietly, suggesting a crossing point a half-day's journey upstream, where the river narrowed and the water was shallower, where even if the ice broke, the consequences would be less severe. The animals might get wet, might even swim briefly, but they would not drown in the deep central channel where the current could sweep them away before anyone could help. The older man considered this, then brought the suggestion to the group. After further discussion, during which various objections were raised and addressed, they accepted Andai's proposal, though not without anxiety that he could see in their faces. If he was wrong, if animals died, the blame would fall on him despite his youth, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. They crossed at dawn, when the ice was strongest from the night's cold. Andai went first, alone, walking slowly, distributing his weight carefully, listening for any warning sounds, for the subtle creaks and groans that indicated stress, for the sharp cracks that would signal the need to retreat immediately. The ice held, the herd followed, driven by the dogs moving in a controlled stream rather than a panicked rush, the animals bunching slightly but not so much that their combined weight might break through, the herders positioned carefully to prevent stampeding while allowing forward progress. Some animals slipped on the smooth surface, their hooves finding no purchase on ice polished by wind. But none fell through, and by midday the entire group was across, the reindeer already spreading out to graze on the far side, where the snow was shallower, and the lichen more abundant than it had been on the near bank. No one thanked Andai directly, but that evening he was given a slightly larger portion of meat, and he heard men mentioning his name in quiet conversations, noting that perhaps the young one had inherited his father's gift, that perhaps the future of the group was secure with such eyes watching ahead. This was how reputation was built in his culture, not through boasting or ceremony, but through the quiet accumulation of successful judgments, of decisions made well, of risks taken that proved justified, each small success adding to a store of trust that might be drawn upon in future crises. As Andai moved into adulthood, his role in the group solidified. He was not a leader in any formal sense. The Sámi had no chiefs or kings, no hierarchy that could be easily mapped onto the feudal structures that governed settled peoples, no single person who could command and expect automatic obedience. But his voice in discussions of migration timing and route selection carried increasing weight. When he spoke, people listened, not because they had to, but because experience had taught them that his judgments were sound, that his suggestions led to outcomes that were generally good, that following his guidance usually meant arriving at pastures ahead of other groups, finding sheltered camping spots, avoiding the worst weather. He married a woman named Sámi, whose family's reindeer merged with his own family's herd, creating a larger, more stable group. The marriage was arranged not by force but by mutual recognition that the combination made sense, that together the families would be stronger than separately, that the merging of herds would create a unit large enough to weather losses while small enough to remain mobile and manageable. Sámi was competent, and quiet, skilled at hide preparation and sewing, able to transform raw reindeer skin into soft, supple leather that could be made into clothing, boots, bags, everything the family needed to survive. She bore 3 children over the years, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom survived infancy, which was fortunate enough to be noteworthy, though not so rare as to be miraculous, the mortality rate being lower among the Sámi than among many settled peoples, perhaps because their mobile lifestyle prevented the accumulation of waste and disease that plagued permanent settlements. Andai taught his children as his father had taught him, through example, through allowing them to observe and then to try, through minimal correction and patient repetition. His son showed aptitude for working with animals, developing an almost intuitive understanding of reindeer behavior, able to predict when an animal was about to bolt, or when it was calm enough to approach, which individuals were leaders and which were followers, which could be trusted to guide others, and which would panic and scatter the herd. His daughters learned the intricate work of transforming raw materials into usable goods, their fingers becoming as skilled as their mothers. They learned to scrape hides until they were perfectly clean, to smoke them so they would remain soft and flexible, to cut patterns that maximize the use of each skin, to sew seams that would hold even in the brutal cold that could make improperly prepared materials brittle and prone to tearing. The years passed in the rhythm that defined all Sámi lives: winter's hardship, spring's movement, summer's brief abundance, autumn's preparation for the cycle to begin again. But within this repetitive framework, small variations created the substance of a life, the accumulation of specific experiences that differentiated one person's existence from another's, even as they all followed the same general pattern. One autumn, Andai scouted far ahead of the group, searching for winter grounds that would provide adequate grazing and shelter. He discovered a valley he had never seen before, sheltered by hills on 3 sides, with south-facing slopes where the snow would be shallowest and the reindeer could dig most easily for lichen, where the angle of winter sun would provide what little warmth was available during the darkest months. He marked the location carefully in his mind, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a crouching bear, a particular arrangement of old pines that grew in a rough circle, as if planted deliberately though they were natural, a stream that cut through the valley in a distinctive curve. These landmarks would allow him to find the place again, even in deep snow that obscured most features, even in darkness that made navigation almost impossible. And he led the group there when winter came. The season that followed was one of relative comfort. The reindeer remaining fat, no one going hungry, the constant anxiety that marked most winters, slightly eased by the knowledge that the animals were thriving, that the lichen was abundant enough to support the herd through even a long, cold season. The next winter he returned to the same valley, and the winter after that and the one after that, until it became an established part of their migration pattern, a place they could count on, a rare certainty in a life defined by uncertainty and constant adaptation to changing conditions. It became known, through quiet sharing of information between groups who met during summer gatherings, as Andai's Valley, though he never claimed ownership, understanding that land could not be possessed, only borrowed temporarily, with the land's consent. Other families began to use it too, timing their migrations to arrive after Andai's group had left, or negotiating with him to share the space, these interactions governed by custom and mutual respect rather than formal law or property rights. But life in the north was never secure, never comfortable for long. When Andai was perhaps 40, age was increasingly difficult to track as his face weathered and his dark hair began to grey. His younger sister died suddenly in the night, killed by what was probably a burst blood vessel in her brain, though of course the Sámi had no such medical knowledge, knew only that she went to sleep and did not wake, passing from life so quietly that her husband did not realize she was gone until morning, when he tried to rouse her and found her body already cooling. The loss hit the community quietly but deeply. Death was common enough, expected in a life as harsh as theirs, but sudden death of a healthy adult was unsettling, a reminder of how fragile the boundary was between life and its absence, how quickly everything could change, how little control anyone had over the fundamental facts of existence. The Joik sung for her at her burial, a song that carried her essence, that was her in sound form, that captured something essential about her being that words could never convey, was composed by Andai himself. It was a simple melody, rising and falling like wind through valleys, built around intervals that seemed to echo the shape of the landscape where she had lived, where she had worked, where she would now remain forever beneath the stones that marked her resting place. And those who heard it said it captured something essential about his sister's steady presence, her quiet competence, her place in the pattern of their shared life. The Joik was not about her, was not a description of her, but rather was her, was the sound that her life would have made if a life could be translated directly into music, bypassing language and its inevitable inadequacies. After her death, Andai changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. He became even quieter, even more deliberate in his movements and speech, as if each action now required more consideration than it had before, as if he had become aware of the weight of every choice in a new way. Some interpreted this as grief, which it partially was, but it was also a deepening understanding of impermanence, of how quickly everything could end, of how little control anyone had over the essential facts of existence. He had always known this intellectually, but now he knew it in his body, in his bones, in the sudden clutch of fear he sometimes felt when watching his own children sleep, terrified that they too might simply not wake, that death might take them as casually as it had taken his sister. He began to spend more time alone, walking far from camp, observing the land with an intensity that seemed almost spiritual. He was looking for something, though he could not have said what, perhaps understanding, perhaps consolation, perhaps simply a way to process emotions that his culture did not encourage him to express openly, that were expected to be born in silence and dignity rather than displayed for others to witness and share. One spring, during the migration toward summer pastures, a sudden storm scattered the reindeer. These animals were generally docile, bred and managed over generations to be tractable and easy to handle, but fear could make them bolt, and wind and snow created the kind of chaos that triggered their instinct to run, to escape from danger, even when running itself was more dangerous than staying still. Andai went after them immediately, leaving the group to continue on their planned route, while he pursued the scattered animals. He tracked them for 3 days, following broken branches and tracks that snow kept trying to erase, sleeping briefly in the shelter of rocks, eating dried meat from his pack, pushing himself beyond normal limits of endurance because he knew that every hour that passed made recovery less likely, that the animals might run so far that finding them would become impossible. He found them in a small valley clustered together as if waiting for him. They had stopped running and were pawing at the snow, searching for food, their panic replaced by the simple animal need to eat, their fear forgotten as completely as if it had never existed. But Andai saw something more in this valley. Like the winter refuge he had discovered years before, this place had qualities that made it valuable. Water from a small stream that somehow remained unfrozen even in deep cold, sheltered grazing, protected from wind by the surrounding hills, natural features that created a microclimate slightly more hospitable than the surrounding landscape. He made note of it, filing away the location in his mental map of useful places. And in future years, when other storms scattered herds, he would sometimes suggest that groups search in this direction, sharing his knowledge quietly, helping others without expecting recognition or gratitude, understanding that survival depended on collective knowledge, on everyone contributing what they had learned, so that the community as a whole became smarter, more capable, more resilient. This was perhaps the highest virtue in Sámi culture, to be helpful without seeking credit, to strengthen the community without diminishing yourself through pride. The man who boasted of his discoveries was viewed with suspicion, not because the discoveries weren't valuable, but because the boasting suggested a dangerous elevation of self over group, a prioritization of individual recognition that could lead to competition and conflict that the community could not afford. As Andai aged, his physical strength diminished, but his knowledge deepened. He became someone the younger herders consulted before making decisions, not because he held any formal authority, but because his judgments had proven reliable over decades, because following his advice had led to good outcomes more often than not, because he had earned respect through the slow accumulation of successful choices. He taught them to pay attention to subtle signs, the behavior of birds before weather changes, how ravens would disappear before major storms, how the sound of wind through different types of terrain could indicate what was coming, whether gentle weather or dangerous conditions. He taught them how reindeer moved when they sensed danger versus when they were simply uncomfortable, the difference between the nervous shifting that meant they smelled a predator and the restless pawing that meant they were dissatisfied with the grazing, but not yet ready to move. His teaching was minimal, often consisting of single sentences or even just gestures. "Watch the ravens," he might say, offering no explanation, trusting the listener to observe and understand, to see for themselves what he had learned to see, to develop their own capacity for reading signs rather than simply memorizing rules that might not apply in every situation. Some learned from him. Others found his elliptical style frustrating and sought guidance elsewhere, preferring more explicit instruction, clearer explanations of cause and effect, more structured learning than Andai's method provided. Andai did not concern himself with this difference, understanding that teaching, like everything else in this life, was a partnership that required willingness from both parties. He could not make someone learn, could only offer what he knew, and hope that some of it would take root, would prove useful, would be passed on in turn to the next generation. In his 60s, though by now age was measured more by his weakening body than any count of years, he began to withdraw from active herding. His joints ached in the cold, the old injury from a fall decades ago now manifesting as a constant pain in his hip that made walking difficult. His breath came harder during long treks. His eyes could no longer see the distant details that had once given him his advantage, the subtle variations in snow texture and animal behavior that required sharp vision and quick observation. But he remained valuable as a keeper of memory, as someone who remembered storms from 40 years past, who could identify patterns across decades, who knew which routes had failed and which had succeeded in circumstances that might never occur again, but might also return tomorrow. When unusual weather appeared, when the group faced conditions they had not encountered before, Andai could often recall a similar situation from his youth, could describe what had worked then and what had failed, providing context that helped others make better decisions. The stories he told now were not entertainment, but instruction, teaching disguised as reminiscence. He would mention, seemingly casually, how a particular autumn had seemed mild, but had given way to a brutal winter, how the signs had been there for those who knew to look. The thickness of animal fur that indicated the reindeer were preparing for severe cold, the early movement of certain birds that normally stayed until late in the season, the timing of the first frost that had come earlier than usual despite the warm days. Younger people listened, or they didn't. Andai had learned not to force knowledge on those who didn't seek it, understanding that wisdom could not be transmitted through words alone, that each person had to learn their own lessons through experience. through making mistakes and living with the consequences, through gradually developing the judgment that came from paying attention over many years. In his final winter, though he did not know it was final, of course, he grew weaker rapidly. The cold that he had endured for decades suddenly seemed unbearable, penetrating into his bones in a way it never had before, the simple act of dressing himself becoming an exhausting effort that left him gasping and needing to rest before he could continue with other tasks. He told his family that he wanted to see Andai's valley one more time, the winter refuge he had discovered so long ago. They tried to dissuade him. The journey was difficult, his body was failing. The winter was particularly harsh that year, with snow deeper than anyone could remember, temperatures lower than usual, wind that cut through even the best clothing and made travel dangerous. But he insisted with a quiet stubbornness that was both characteristic and unusual. Normally he was flexible, willing to defer to others' judgments, but in this he was immovable, refusing to be talked out of what he knew might be his last journey, what might be his final chance to see the place that had meant so much to his life, that had sheltered his people through so many difficult winters. They took him there, pulling him on a sled because he could no longer walk the distance. He sat in the valley for hours, looking at the familiar shapes of hills and trees, watching the reindeer paw at the snow, listening to the wind, experiencing the place with an intensity that suggested he was trying to memorize it, to carry it with him wherever he was going, to hold it in his mind as a final gift, a last moment of connection with the land that had shaped his entire existence. What he thought during those hours, no one knows. Perhaps he was remembering his life, the migrations and seasons and small triumphs that had filled his years, the countless decisions that had brought him to this moment, the pattern of his existence stretching back to that spring snowstorm where it had all begun. Perhaps he was simply being present, experiencing the moment without thought or reflection, the way the reindeer experienced the snow and the grass and the wind, without narrative or meaning, just the pure sensation of being alive in this particular place at this particular time. Perhaps he was preparing for death in the way his culture understood preparation, making peace with the ending that comes to everything, accepting the inevitable with the same patience and humility that had characterized his entire life. He died 2 days later, in his sleep, in the lavu where he had spent so many winters. It was a good death, as deaths went in that place and time. Quick, without prolonged suffering, surrounded by family who had loved him in their quiet way, who had valued him not for any grand accomplishments, but for his steady presence, his reliable judgment, his willingness to share what he knew without demanding recognition or reward. They buried him in the traditional way, wrapping his body in his finest clothing, placing it in a wooden coffin along with items he would need for whatever journey came next. His bone tools worn smooth by decades of use, his pipe carved from birchwood, a small portion of dried meat, a knife that had been his father's before him. These objects were not valuable in any monetary sense, but they were part of who he had been, extensions of his identity that would accompany him into whatever came after this life. The burial site was marked with stones, though snow would cover them soon enough, and over years the markers would disappear, erased by weather and time. The exact location would be forgotten within a generation or two, becoming just another place in the landscape, indistinguishable from the countless other spots where other bodies rested beneath the earth and snow. His joik was sung, the sound portrait of his life, and those who heard it said it sounded like footsteps through deep snow, patient and steady and endless, the rhythm of migration made audible. It rose and fell like the land itself, echoing the valleys and hills he had walked, carrying within it something essential about the way he had moved through the world, the quiet competence that had defined his existence, the patient endurance that had seen him through 7 decades of harsh living, Andai's life had not been extraordinary. He had not led armies or built monuments or made discoveries that changed his world in obvious ways, had not accumulated wealth or power or fame, had not done anything that would be recorded in the histories that document the lives of kings and conquerors and saints. He had simply lived well in the way his culture measured living, with competence, humility, care for others, and attention to the responsibilities that his particular skills demanded. He had fulfilled his role in the community's survival, had passed on what he knew, had made the lives of those around him slightly better and slightly safer through his contributions, and had done all of this without expecting applause or recognition. But in that simplicity was something profound, a way of being human that modern people have largely forgotten. A life measured not by achievement or accumulation, but by participation in patterns larger than the self, by fulfilling a role in a community's survival, by passing knowledge to the next generation so they might continue the work. His life was valuable not because it was unique, but because it was typical, because it represented a way of living that had sustained his people for thousands of years, that had allowed them to thrive in one of Earth's harshest environments through cooperation and shared knowledge rather than competition and individual glory. After his death, people continued to use Andai's valley, though increasingly they forgot who had discovered it, forgot even that it had been discovered rather than always known. His name faded from memory within a generation, as all names eventually fade unless they are written down, and the Sámi did not record their history in books or monuments, but carried it in memory and song, in stories that changed with each telling, in knowledge that was practical rather than historical. But the roots he found, the crossing points he identified, the seasonal refugees he located, these remained in use, embedded in the collective knowledge of his people, his contribution living on not as individual recognition but as communal inheritance. Young herders still led their animals across the river at the shallow point he had found, still brought them to graze in the valleys he had discovered, still used the pathways he had identified, all without knowing that these choices were not obvious, that someone had once risked being wrong in order to find these solutions. This was perhaps the most Sámi thing about Reindeer Andai, that his greatest legacy was anonymous, that his life's work dissolved into the general store of knowledge that allowed his people to survive, that he would have wanted nothing more than this dissolution, this merging of self into community, this quiet disappearance that left the group stronger than it had been before his arrival. He had never sought to make himself indispensable, had never tried to hoard knowledge as a source of personal power, had given away everything he learned so that others might benefit, so that the community's collective wisdom would grow with each generation. The reindeer still move through the valleys he walked. The snow still falls where he slept, covering the same ground he covered, following the same patterns that have repeated for millennia, indifferent to human presence or absence. The land he read so carefully continues its slow cycles, indifferent to human memory, patient and eternal. Winter becomes spring, becomes summer, becomes autumn, becomes winter again, the wheel turning without pause or acknowledgement, the same processes that shaped the landscape when Andai was born, still shaping it now, still shaping it in the future, that stretches beyond our ability to imagine. And somewhere in that indifference, in that patience, lies a kind of immortality, more real than fame. The immortality of having participated fully in the great wheel of life and death and continuation, of having added your small weight to the collective survival of your people, of having lived and died without needing the world to remember, because the world itself, in its slow way, carries everything forward. The land remembers in ways that have nothing to do with names or monuments, remembers through the paths still walked, through the knowledge still used, through the continuing presence of people who live as Andai lived, moving with the seasons, following the reindeer, reading the land with patient attention, adding their own small contributions to the vast accumulation of wisdom that makes survival possible in places where survival should be impossible. The North holds its secrets differently than other places. Where southern lands bury their mysteries in earth or jungle, the Arctic hides truth beneath layers of snow and ice, preserving and erasing simultaneously, creating a landscape where memory becomes unreliable and the boundary between fact and story grows soft and permeable. The Sámi lived in this ambiguous space, and their understanding of reality reflected this ambiguity. They were practical people. Survival demanded practicality, but their practicality coexisted with a worldview that acknowledged forces and presences that could not be seen or measured, but that shaped experience nonetheless. Whether these forces were real or imagined is perhaps the wrong question. The Sámi did not draw such clear distinctions between the spiritual and material worlds, understanding that both were aspects of a single, unified existence. Their world was one where the division between observer and observed, between subject and object, remained fluid in ways that modern Western thought struggles to comprehend. In this worldview, consciousness was not confined to human beings, but radiated outward, present in varying degrees throughout the natural world, making relationship rather than domination the fundamental mode of engagement with existence. In the landscape itself, the first mysteries appeared. Scattered across the tundra, often in places that seemed chosen rather than random, stood old trees, usually pines, but sometimes birch, that bore the marks of human attention. Strips of cloth, weathered to colorlessness by sun and wind, hung from their branches. Antlers rested against their trunks, positioned with care. Sometimes metal objects, coins, bells, small knives, were wedged into bark or hung from leather cords. These accumulations had a weight that exceeded their material presence, each object representing not just itself, but the intention behind its placement, the moment when someone paused in their journey to acknowledge something larger than themselves. These were offering trees, places where people had left gifts for reasons that were never fully explained to outsiders, and perhaps never fully articulated even among the Sámi themselves. The trees marked boundaries between the ordinary and the sacred, points where communication with the unseen became possible. What was being communicated? To whom? The answers varied depending on who you asked, and often the person making an offering could not clearly explain their motivation. They left the gift because it felt right, because tradition demanded it, because the place itself seemed to ask for acknowledgement. The trees were not worshipped exactly. The Sámi were not animists in the simple sense that word implies, but they recognized that some places held power, that the land was not uniform in its qualities, that certain locations demanded respect in ways that could not be reduced to rational explanation. This recognition was not theological doctrine, but lived experience, knowledge built from countless encounters with landscape that had taught earlier generations which places mattered and why. Near these trees you might feel watched, not threatened, but observed by something patient and ancient that had no particular interest in your welfare, but that noticed your presence nonetheless. This feeling was subtle, easy to dismiss as imagination or nerves, yet consistent enough across generations that it had become part of the cultural understanding of these places. Whether the feeling originated from external sources or from some deep psychological mechanism triggered by cultural conditioning remained an open question, one that the Sámi themselves did not feel compelled to resolve. Modern people encountering such trees might see only superstition, primitive beliefs that science has rendered obsolete. But the Sámi were not primitive, and their beliefs were not simple. They lived in intimate relationship with a landscape that could kill them effortlessly, and they had learned over centuries that survival required acknowledging forces beyond their control, respecting boundaries they could not fully understand. Their knowledge system was sophisticated in ways that utilitarian rationality often fails to recognize, encoding complex information about relationship, reciprocity, and the limits of human agency in forms that might appear to outsiders as mere ritual or superstition. Among the most mysterious and powerful objects in Sámi culture were the drums. Runebommer, they were called in Norwegian, though the Sámi had their own names for them. These were not musical instruments in the ordinary sense, though they did produce sound. They were tools of communication, of prophecy, of navigation between worlds. Each drum was unique, reflecting the understanding and spiritual development of its maker, and no two were identical in their construction or symbolic language. The drums were made from reindeer skin stretched over a wooden frame, the frame itself carved from special trees chosen for their straightness and resonance. The selection of the tree was itself a ritual act, requiring knowledge of wood properties and spiritual sensitivity to choose correctly. The skin was prepared with extreme care, scraped to uniform thinness, dried slowly to prevent cracking. This preparation could take weeks or months, and the quality of the final drum depended on the patience and skill applied during this painstaking process. On the drum's surface, the drum maker painted symbols in a red dye made from alder bark. These symbols varied from drum to drum, each one unique, each one encoding the particular knowledge and understanding of its maker. The symbols were not random decoration. They formed a map, but not a map of physical geography. They charted spiritual territory, showing the relationships between different aspects of existence, marking pathways that could be traveled not by foot, but by consciousness. The arrangement of symbols reflected a sophisticated cosmology, one that understood reality as layered and interconnected, with each realm influencing the others in patterns that could be learned and navigated by those with proper training. You might see symbols representing the sun and moon, animals and spirits, humans and ancestors, the upper world and lower world, all connected by lines that showed how energy and information flowed between different realms. But understanding these symbols required more than visual interpretation. Their meaning was taught person to person, knowledge passed carefully from teacher to student, and much of that teaching was experiential rather than verbal. You learned what a symbol meant not through definition, but through using it, through entering the states of consciousness where its significance became apparent through direct experience rather than intellectual comprehension. The drums were used for divination. A small bone pointer, often carved from reindeer antler, was placed on the drum's surface, and as the drum was beaten with a special hammer made from reindeer horn, the pointer would move, dancing across the symbols, and its path would be read by the noaidi, the spiritual specialist who knew how to interpret the pointer's journey. What questions were asked of the drums? Practical ones mostly. Which direction should the group travel to find good grazing? Would the coming winter be harsh or mild? Where had a lost reindeer wandered? Was a sick person's illness caused by natural forces or spiritual interference? These questions were not trivial. They concerned matters of life and death, the difference between survival and disaster in an environment that offered little margin for error. The drum's answers guided decisions that affected entire communities, and the accuracy of these answers determined whether the noaidi maintained their authority or lost the trust that made their practice possible. But the drums were not merely tools for answering questions. The noaidi used them to journey into altered states of consciousness, entering trance through a combination of drumming, chanting, and focused intention. In these states, they claimed to travel to other worlds to speak with spirits and ancestors, to retrieve information that could not be obtained through ordinary means. These journeys were described with remarkable consistency across different practitioners and different time periods, suggesting either a shared reality being accessed or a powerfully consistent psychological phenomenon shaped by cultural expectation and training. Were these journeys real? The question itself reflects a modern framework that the Sámi would not have recognized. For them, reality was not divided into objective fact and subjective experience. The journey was real in the sense that it produced effects, changed circumstances, provided knowledge. Whether it happened in physical space or consciousness was irrelevant. What mattered was efficacy, whether the journey accomplished its purpose, whether the sick person recovered, whether the lost reindeer was found, whether the predicted weather patterns proved accurate. The drums were dangerous objects. They held power, and power could harm as easily as help. Only those properly trained could use them safely, and even then, risks remained. Stories circulated of noaidi who had become lost in their journeys, who had returned changed or damaged, who had attracted the wrong kind of attention from forces that did not wish human interference. Christian missionaries, when they arrived in Sámi lands, recognized the drums as threats to their conversion efforts. The drums represented a complete worldview, incompatible with Christian cosmology, a system of knowledge and practice that could not be easily assimilated or dismissed. The missionaries collected drums, sometimes by persuasion, sometimes by force, and burned them or sent them to museums in southern cities where they were displayed as curiosities from a dying culture. Hundreds of drums were destroyed this way, their knowledge lost, their symbolic language made illegible when the chain of teaching was broken. Some drums survived, hidden by families who recognized their value and refused to surrender them despite pressure and threats. These hidden drums were used in secret, their power channeled quietly, without announcement. But even among the Sámi, the meaning of the drums began to fade. As Christianity spread and traditional practices were suppressed, the knowledge required to create and use drums properly was lost. By the 19th century, few people remained who could read the symbols fluently or enter the trance states the drums facilitated. The drums became artifacts rather than tools, objects whose purpose was remembered, but whose actual operation had become mysterious even to their cultural descendants. Today, drums exist in museums, their surfaces cracked with age, their meanings largely opaque. Scholars study them, measuring their dimensions, photographing their symbols, trying to reconstruct their significance through comparison and analysis. But something essential is missing from this scholarly study: the lived experience, the embedded understanding, the way meaning emerges not from analyzing symbols, but from using them within a specific cultural and spiritual context. The drums in museums are like books in a language no one can read, their information intact but inaccessible, a peculiar form of preservation that saves the object while losing what made it meaningful. The drums are silent now except when handled by museum curators or researchers. And perhaps that silence is fitting, a reminder of how easily knowledge disappears when the chain of transmission breaks, how fragile culture is, how much has been lost. Related to the drums but distinct from them was another Sámi practice that carried deep mystery: the joik, the vocal tradition that was not quite song, not quite chant, but something in between. The joik exists in a category that Western musical taxonomy struggles to accommodate, belonging fully to neither music nor speech, but occupying a third space that serves different purposes than either. Joik is difficult to describe to those who have never heard it. It does not follow Western musical conventions. There are no verses or choruses, no clear beginning or end, no lyrics in the usual sense. A joik might contain words, but it might also be entirely vocalized, carried on sounds that hover between music and speech. The structure, such as it is, emerges from the subject being joiked rather than from musical convention, making each joik a unique sonic signature that cannot be transposed or adapted without losing its essential quality. Each joik was unique, created to capture the essence of a specific person, place, or animal. To joik someone was not to sing about them, but to sing them, to create a sound portrait that was somehow equivalent to the thing itself. How did this work? How could sound be equivalent to a person? The Sámi understood joik not as representation, but as invocation. When you joiked someone, you made them present, brought their essence into the moment through the pattern of sound. This was not metaphor. The joik was the person, in the same way that a reflection is simultaneously separate from and identical to the thing reflected. Learning to joik required a particular kind of attention. You had to observe the person or place so carefully that you absorbed their quality, their particular way of being, and then you had to translate that quality into sound without thinking too much about the translation, letting it emerge intuitively. This process could not be rushed or formalized into method. It required a state of openness and receptivity that allowed the joik to arrive rather than being consciously constructed. The resulting joiks were often simple, built from just a few notes repeated and varied, but within that simplicity was complexity, subtle shifts in emphasis, moments where the voice caught or soared, patterns that seemed random but that somehow conveyed meaning. To the untrained ear, joiks might sound monotonous or primitive, but to those familiar with the tradition, each one was as distinct and recognizable as a face, carrying information that could not be expressed any other way. Joiking was personal and communal simultaneously. You might joik alone, but joiks were also performed in groups, voices overlapping, creating layers of meaning that were richer than any individual could produce. The joik tradition was suppressed along with other Sámi practices condemned by missionaries as pagan, as demonic, as dangerous to Christian souls. Children were punished for joiking, adults shamed for maintaining the practice. But joik was harder to eradicate than drums because it required no physical object, existed only in memory and voice, could be practiced silently, internally, kept alive through subtle resistance. This resilience speaks to something fundamental about joik, its rootedness, not in material culture, but in the deep structures of attention and relationship that shaped Sámi consciousness, structures that could adapt and persist even when their outward expressions were forbidden. And unlike the drums, joik has survived into the present. Modern Sámi still joik, still teach the tradition to their children, still use it to connect with ancestors and land and each other, but even this survival carries ambiguity. Is modern joik the same as historical joik? When the cultural context changes, when people live in houses instead of lavas, when reindeer herding is a choice rather than necessity, does the practice retain its original meaning, or does it become something new, something that looks like tradition but functions differently? These questions have no definitive answers, only the ongoing negotiation between preservation and adaptation that characterizes all living traditions. There are no clear answers to these questions, only the ongoing negotiation between past and present, continuity and change. What remains certain is that joik continues to serve as a vehicle for something essential in Sámi identity, a practice that connects contemporary people to ancestors and landscape in ways that remain meaningful even when the specific context of use has transformed. Beyond drums and joik, the Sámi landscape itself held mysteries. Scattered across the tundra were stone formations, cairns that marked paths, graves that held the dead, arrangements that seemed deliberately placed, but whose purpose had been forgotten even by the Sámi themselves. Some of these stones were ancient, predating the Sámi, left by earlier peoples whose names are lost, whose languages are extinct, whose beliefs can only be guessed at through the silent evidence of their constructions. The Sámi inherited a landscape already marked by human presence, already layered with meaning, and they added their own interpretations and uses to structures whose original purposes had vanished into prehistory. Walking among these stones, you felt history as weight, as presence. Countless generations had passed through this landscape, each leaving traces, each responding to the same challenges of cold and darkness and survival. The Sámi built upon this palimpsest, adding their own marks, their own meanings, sometimes incorporating older structures into their worldview, giving ancient stones new significance. This adaptive reuse of sacred sites was not appropriation, but continuation, recognition that certain places held power that transcended any single cultural interpretation. Near some of these cairns, archaeologists have found offerings, pieces of broken pottery, corroded metal, bones from animals. The offerings were not rich, the Sámi had little wealth to spare, but they were deliberate, representing sacrifice, the giving up of something valuable in hopes of receiving something more valuable in return. What did they hope to receive? Safe passage, good hunting, protection from storms, healing for the sick, countless small interventions in a life that offered little margin for error. The northern lights, aurora borealis, held particular significance in Sámi belief. These shimmering curtains of green and sometimes red and purple light that danced across winter skies were beautiful and terrible manifestations of power that could not be controlled or predicted. Different Sámi groups told different stories about the lights. Some said they were spirits of the dead dancing in the sky. Others claimed they were caused by a great fox whose tail swept across the snow, throwing up sparks that became the aurora. Still others saw them as reflections of distant fires or as light escaping from the realm of the dead, each interpretation carrying its own implications about the relationship between this world and others. But, regardless of the specific story, most agreed on one thing: you did not whistle at the northern lights. Doing so would attract their attention, and their attention was dangerous. Why dangerous? The explanations varied. Some said the lights might descend and carry you away. Others suggested they could drive you mad or bring misfortune to your family. The prohibition might have had practical origins. Whistling in extreme cold can cause frostbite on lips, but it had become something more, a taboo that carried the weight of collective wisdom, of experiences passed down through generations. The taboo functioned as cultural knowledge encoded in behavioral restriction, a way of preserving information about danger without requiring explicit understanding of mechanism. Even Sámi, who had adopted Christianity, who no longer believed in the old spirits, often maintained the prohibition against whistling at the lights, unable to quite shake the feeling that doing so was unwise, that some rules existed for reasons deeper than rational explanation. This persistence of practice beyond belief demonstrates how cultural knowledge can survive in forms that outlast the cosmological framework that originally gave it meaning. The noaidi, the shamanic specialists who used the drums and who mediated between human community and spiritual forces, were themselves mysterious figures. They were not separate from the community, not priests who stood apart, but rather ordinary people who had received special training and who could access states of consciousness unavailable to others. How did someone become a noaidi? Sometimes through heredity, knowledge passed from parent to child. Sometimes through calling, a person showing signs, unusual dreams, illnesses that came and went mysteriously, an ability to see or hear things others could not, that marked them as suitable for the role. The selection process was not formalized but emerged organically from observation and recognition, the community identifying in certain individuals capacities that could be developed through training. The training was long and difficult, requiring years of learning to control consciousness, to enter and exit trance states at will, to navigate the spirit world without becoming lost or damaged by the experience. Much of this training happened through apprenticeship, the student working closely with an experienced noaidi, learning not just techniques, but the subtle judgment required to use them appropriately and safely. The noaidi's power was ambiguous. They could heal, but they could also harm. They could find lost objects, predict weather, communicate with the dead, but their abilities made them objects of both respect and fear. This ambivalence was appropriate given the nature of their role, which required them to traffic in forces that were neither good nor evil, but simply powerful, requiring careful handling and clear intention. If misfortune struck a community, suspicion might fall on the noaidi. Had they failed to perform necessary rituals? Had they misused their power? Had they angered spirits through carelessness or pride? The noaidi walked a narrow path between service and threat, their authority constantly negotiated, constantly dependent on producing results that justified the community's trust and tolerance. This precarious position meant that a noaidi's effectiveness was measured not just in successful interventions, but in their ability to maintain community confidence, to explain failures in ways that preserved faith in the system even when specific outcomes disappointed. When Christianity arrived, the noaidi were particular targets for conversion or suppression. Missionaries understood that these spiritual specialists represented organized opposition to Christian cosmology, that as long as the noaidi maintained their practice, full conversion would be impossible. Some noaidi converted, abandoning their drums and practices, accepting Christian teachings either from genuine conviction or from pragmatic recognition that resistance was futile. Others maintained their practices in secret or moved to remote areas where missionary influence was weak. A few attempted to synthesize, trying to incorporate Christian elements into Sámi spirituality or vice versa, creating hybrid systems that satisfied neither Christians nor traditionalists, but that represented genuine attempts to navigate between worlds. These syncretic practices were often unstable, unable to fully reconcile the fundamental incompatibilities between the two worldviews, yet they persisted in various forms as people sought ways to honor both their ancestral traditions and their new religious commitments. The fate of the noaidi tradition reflects the broader pattern of colonization, not simple suppression or replacement, but complex negotiation, partial survival, transformation that preserved some elements while losing others. What emerged was neither pure continuity nor complete rupture, but something more complicated, a patchwork of practices and beliefs that bore traces of their origins while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Today, there are people who claim the title of noaidi, who attempt to practice shamanic healing and divination in ways they believe are continuous with historical tradition. Whether this represents genuine continuity or reconstructed tradition built from fragments and imagination is impossible to determine with certainty. Perhaps the question itself misses the point. Perhaps what matters is not perfect historical accuracy, but the human need to connect with something deeper than material existence, to maintain practices that acknowledge mystery and complexity in a world increasingly devoted to explanation and control. The Sámi landscape is littered with sacred sites, springs that never freeze, caves where offerings accumulate, lakes where strange things are seen, mountains that demand respect and silence. These sites are not tourist attractions, not marked on maps, not explained by informational plaques. They exist in the quiet knowledge of people who live in relationship with the land, who understand that some places are different, that geography is not morally or spiritually uniform, that the earth itself has gradations of power and meaning. The knowledge of these sites is transmitted informally through stories and experience, each generation learning from the previous which places matter and how they should be approached. To walk past one of these sites without acknowledgement would be unthinkable for traditional Sámi, not because of fear of punishment, but because the acknowledgement is natural, automatic, the appropriate response to a genuine quality that the site possesses. This acknowledgement might take the form of a small offering, a moment of silence, a mental greeting, any gesture that recognized the place as something more than mere geography. Modern people, walking the same paths, often feel nothing, see nothing remarkable, dismiss the whole concept as primitive superstition. But occasionally someone reports feeling watched, feeling unwelcome, feeling an unease they cannot rationally explain. Are these feelings evidence of spiritual reality, or are they psychological projections, the human tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli as meaningful? The Sámi would not have bothered with such questions, content to accept experience without requiring it to fit into neat philosophical categories. Archaeology in Sámi lands reveals layer upon layer of habitation, stone tools from prehistoric hunters, bronze implements from later periods, iron objects from more recent centuries, each layer telling a story of adaptation and survival. The archaeological record shows remarkable continuity of presence, peoples adapting to the same harsh environment across millennia, developing increasingly sophisticated strategies for survival while maintaining fundamental patterns of movement and resource use. But archaeology can only reveal material culture. The beliefs, the stories, the subtle understanding of place and relationship, these leave no physical trace, disappear when the last person who held them dies. We can measure the dimensions of ancient tent sites, identify the bones of animals eaten thousands of years ago, map migration routes through the distribution of artifacts. But we cannot recover the songs that were sung, the dreams that guided decisions, the felt sense of living in a particular relationship with land and animal and spirit. This is the ultimate mystery of the Sámi past, not specific, unanswered questions about material facts, but the vast unknowability of subjective experience, the unbridgeable gap between artifacts and the lives that produced them. We possess the material residue of existence but lack access to the consciousness that gave that existence meaning, a loss that no amount of careful excavation can remedy. And perhaps this mystery is valuable precisely because it is unsolvable. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts to be mastered, but a vast ocean of human experience, most of which is lost forever, accessible only through imagination, guided by the fragmentary evidence that survives. The snow falls, covering everything. The wind blows, erasing tracks. Time passes, wearing down memory. The Arctic climate that preserved so much material evidence also ensured that other evidence would vanish, organic materials decomposing, wooden structures collapsing, the landscape constantly reshaped by the slow violence of ice and wind. What remains? Stories, partial and transformed. Objects in museums, silent and decontextualized. Place names in a language fewer people speak each generation. The landscape itself bearing scars and marks whose meanings shift with each generation that interprets them. These fragments are not nothing. They provide genuine connection to the past, but they are also profoundly incomplete, raising as many questions as they answer. And somewhere beneath it all, the echo of drums that no longer sound, the presence of spirits that may never have existed, or that exist still, patiently, in places where modern minds no longer know to look. The metaphor captures something essential about cultural loss, the sense that something has been silenced without being destroyed, that absence itself can be a form of presence. The mysteries of Sámi culture are not puzzles to be solved, but rather invitations to humility, reminders that knowledge has limits, that some things cannot be recovered once lost, that the past is simultaneously close enough to touch and infinitely distant. To study Sámi history is to confront the limitations of historical method, to recognize that understanding always remains partial, that the subjective dimension of human experience resists the objectifying gaze of academic investigation. In the deep winter darkness, when the northern lights dance overhead and the world is reduced to white snow and black sky, you might feel what the Sámi felt. Not specific beliefs that can be articulated, but a quality of attention, an openness to presences that cannot be proven or disproven, only experienced or dismissed. The landscape itself teaches this attention if you allow it, the vast emptiness and the subtle variations within that emptiness, the way meaning emerges from relationship rather than from the inherent properties of isolated things. This is the final mystery, not the content of Sámi spirituality, but the epistemological question it raises. How do we know what we know? What counts as evidence? When is skepticism wisdom, and when is it blindness? These questions matter not just for understanding the Sámi, but for understanding ourselves, our own assumptions about what constitutes reality and how we should relate to it. The snow continues to fall, patient and eternal, covering questions and answers equally, preserving and erasing in the same soft, relentless motion. In this there is something deeply appropriate, a metaphor that captures the nature of historical understanding itself, the way knowledge accumulates and vanishes, the way certainty gives way to doubt, and then to new certainties that will themselves eventually dissolve. The Sámi understood impermanence in ways that agricultural societies often did not. Their nomadic existence taught them that attachment to place was different from attachment to land, that home was not a fixed location, but a pattern of movement, a relationship rather than a possession. This understanding extended to spiritual matters as well. The sacred sites were important, but not exclusive. Sacredness was a quality that could manifest in many locations, and the Sámi worldview maintained flexibility about where and how the sacred might appear. Their spirituality was not bound to temples or churches, not dependent on permanent structures that claimed to fix the divine in one location. Instead, it flowed across the landscape, present wherever attention and intention created openings for encounter with something beyond the ordinary. This mobility of the sacred made Sámi spirituality resilient in some ways, but vulnerable in others. It could not be destroyed by demolishing buildings, but it could be eroded by disrupting the patterns of movement and relationship that gave it context and meaning. When reindeer herding was restricted, when traditional migration routes were blocked by borders and development, when people were forced into permanent settlements, the spatial dimension of Sámi spirituality was compromised. The lived experience of moving through sacred landscape replaced by memory and imagination. The transition from practice to memory represents a profound form of loss, the difference between knowledge embodied in action and knowledge preserved only in abstraction. Contemporary Sámi face the challenge of maintaining cultural continuity in circumstances radically different from those of their ancestors. Some have returned to reindeer herding, attempting to practice it in traditional ways despite economic pressures and environmental changes that make such practice increasingly difficult. Others have moved away from herding entirely, finding other ways to maintain Sámi identity and values. Both paths involve negotiation between tradition and modernity, between preservation and adaptation. The joy continues, but often in concert halls rather than around campfires, performed for audiences rather than emerging spontaneously from daily life. Does this change what joik means, or does it simply represent the tradition adapting to new contexts? The drums remain in museums, but some Sámi have created new drums, attempting to revive the tradition using historical examples as guides. Are these new drums authentic, or are they something else? Objects that resemble their historical predecessors, but that function differently in a world where shamanic practice is no longer a central feature of community life. These questions matter because they concern the nature of cultural survival, whether traditions can maintain meaning when their contexts transform, whether authenticity is possible after rupture, or whether what emerges is always something new, wearing the clothing of the past. There are no simple answers, only the ongoing work of each generation to determine what to preserve, what to adapt, and what to let go. Language plays a crucial role in this cultural continuity. The Sámi languages, there are several, not mutually intelligible, carry within them ways of understanding the world that cannot be fully translated into other languages. They contain words for specific snow conditions, for particular aspects of reindeer behavior, for states of consciousness and relationship that have no equivalents in Norwegian or Swedish or Finnish. When a language is lost, these distinctions vanish, and with them a particular way of being in the world. Efforts to preserve and revitalize Sámi languages have met with varying success. Some children now learn Sámi in school, but often as a second language, their primary linguistic world shaped by the dominant culture. This bilingualism creates new kinds of Sámi identity, people who maintain connection to their heritage while also participating fully in contemporary Scandinavian society. Whether this represents successful adaptation or dilution depends on perspective, on what one values and what one is willing to lose. The political dimension of Sámi identity has also evolved. Once simply a cultural designation, being Sámi has become a political category with implications for land rights, resource management, and self-determination. The Sámi parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland provide some degree of political representation, though their power remains limited. This politicization of identity has strengthened Sámi cohesion in some ways, but has also created tensions, particularly around questions of who counts as Sámi and what criteria should determine membership in the community. These modern concerns might seem far removed from the mysteries of drums and spirits, from offering trees and northern lights, but they are connected by the ongoing question of what it means to be Sámi in a world that has changed dramatically from the one in which Sámi culture originally developed. The political and the spiritual cannot be easily separated, both involving questions of identity, sovereignty, and relationship to land and heritage. Tourism has brought new complications. The Arctic has become a destination, and Sámi culture has become a commodity, something to be experienced and consumed by visitors seeking authentic encounters with indigenous traditions. Some Sámi have embraced tourism as an economic opportunity and a way to share their culture on their own terms. Others resist it, seeing it as exploitation and dilution of sacred practices. The presence of tourists at sacred sites, the performance of joik for audiences who lack cultural context to understand it properly, the sale of traditional crafts made using modern techniques, all raise questions about commodification and authenticity, about the relationship between cultural practice and economic survival. These tensions have no easy resolution, only the continuous work of negotiating boundaries and determining what can be shared and what should remain private. Climate change adds another dimension of threat and transformation. The Arctic is warming faster than the rest of the planet, and these changes affect everything from reindeer migration patterns to the stability of traditional knowledge about weather and seasons. If the snow falls differently, if the ice freezes later and melts earlier, if familiar patterns of plant and animal life shift in response to changing temperatures, then the accumulated wisdom of centuries becomes less reliable. The landscape itself, which has been both text and teacher for Sámi culture, is being rewritten in ways that may eventually render traditional knowledge obsolete. This presents a profound challenge, not just practically but spiritually. If the land changes beyond recognition, if the relationship between people and place is disrupted by forces beyond anyone's control, what happens to a culture whose identity has been shaped by that specific relationship? Can Sámi culture persist in a radically altered Arctic, or will it necessarily transform into something new? Again, no certain answers exist, only the recognition that cultures have always adapted to changing circumstances and that the future will require unprecedented flexibility and creativity. Yet despite all these challenges, something persists. The Sámi remain, maintaining identity and practice against considerable odds, refusing to disappear into the dominant culture even as they participate in it and shape it. The languages continue to be spoken, taught to children who carry them forward into uncertain futures. The joik still sounds, connecting contemporary singers to ancestors and landscape through patterns of sound that have endured for generations. The sacred sites remain, still known to those who maintain the old relationships, still holding whatever power they have always held, patient and indifferent to the changes swirling around them. This persistence is not static preservation, but living adaptation, the tradition continuing to breathe and grow even as it carries forward essential elements from the past. Perhaps this is the most important mystery of all. Not the specific practices or beliefs that outsiders find exotic or incomprehensible, but the resilience that allows a culture to maintain identity through centuries of pressure, suppression, and change. What gives cultures this resilience? How do they know what to preserve and what to release? How do they maintain continuity without becoming trapped in nostalgia or fantasy? The Sámi offer no explicit answers to these questions, but their ongoing existence demonstrates that such adaptation is possible, that cultures can bend without breaking, can transform while maintaining essential qualities that connect present to past. This may be the most valuable teaching the Sámi have to offer the wider world, a lesson in persistence, in the patient work of maintaining identity across generations, in refusing to let colonization or modernization or climate change have the final word. The sun moves in its strange Arctic pattern, disappearing for months in winter, circling the sky without setting during summer. In this land of extremes, where darkness and light reach intensities unknown in temperate zones, the Sámi learned to live, to find meaning and beauty in harshness, to build culture in conditions that might seem to preclude it. Their achievement is not the romanticized harmony with nature that outsiders often project onto indigenous peoples, but something more complex and interesting, a practical mysticism that acknowledged both the physical challenges of survival and the spiritual dimensions of existence, that maintained technical skill alongside receptivity to mystery, that respected both the measurable and the ineffable. This balance is increasingly rare in a world that tends toward either materialist reduction or spiritual escapism, and its preservation offers possibilities for ways of being that modern Western culture has largely forgotten or dismissed. As the Arctic continues to change, as globalization and climate disruption reshape the possibilities for life in the far north, the Sámi face an uncertain future. But they face it as they have faced previous challenges, with a combination of practicality and spiritual depth, with willingness to adapt combined with determination to preserve what matters most. The mysteries remain, not as puzzles awaiting solution, but as dimensions of experience that resist reduction to explanation. They persist in the feeling one gets standing alone on the tundra at twilight, in the way certain places seem to demand acknowledgement, in the resonance of a joik that somehow captures in sound what words cannot express. These are not supernatural mysteries in the sense of violations of natural law, but rather mysteries in the deeper sense, aspects of existence that exceed our conceptual frameworks, that remind us that the world contains more than our theories can encompass. The Sámi relationship to these mysteries was neither credulous acceptance nor skeptical dismissal, but rather a kind of practical agnosticism that acknowledged the limits of certain knowledge while remaining open to experiences that could not be neatly categorized. This epistemological humility seems increasingly valuable in an age characterized by overconfidence in explanatory systems, whether scientific or spiritual. The Sámi approach suggests a middle path, neither rejecting rational analysis nor elevating it to the sole arbiter of truth, neither embracing every claim of spiritual experience, nor dismissing such experiences as mere delusion or projection. The offering trees continue to accumulate gifts, though now some of those gifts are modern objects, coins from various currencies, bits of bright plastic alongside weathered cloth, contemporary expressions of an ancient impulse. The practice adapts even as it continues, incorporating new materials while maintaining the fundamental gesture of acknowledgement and reciprocity. Whether those who leave these offerings believe in the same way their ancestors believed is impossible to determine. Perhaps belief itself has changed, become more metaphorical or psychological, a way of marking intention rather than appealing to literal spirits. Or perhaps the belief remains fundamentally unchanged, merely articulated differently to accommodate contemporary frameworks of understanding. The interior experience of belief remains private, accessible only through its outward expressions, and those expressions can be interpreted in multiple ways without necessarily revealing what happens in the consciousness of the believer. The academic study of Sámi culture continues, producing dissertations and monographs, conferences and journals dedicated to documenting and analyzing every aspect of traditional and contemporary Sámi life. This scholarship serves important purposes, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost, providing resources for Sámi people interested in their own heritage, contributing to broader understanding of indigenous cultures and their challenges. But scholarship also carries limitations and dangers. It can objectify living traditions, turning them into objects of study rather than lived practices. It can impose external categories and frameworks that distort more than they illuminate. It can create a kind of museum effect where practices are preserved in amber, documented thoroughly but drained of vitality, their meanings fixed by academic interpretation rather than allowed to evolve organically within their cultural context. The best scholarship recognizes these limitations and works in collaboration with Sámi people, allowing them to guide research priorities and methods, respecting their authority over their own cultural heritage. This collaborative approach acknowledges that outsiders can contribute understanding but can never fully access the insider perspective, that there are dimensions of cultural knowledge that remain properly private, not secrets to be uncovered, but sacred spaces to be respected. Among younger Sámi, there is renewed interest in traditional practices, a hunger to reconnect with heritage that earlier generations sometimes sought to escape. This revitalization movement has produced artists, musicians, writers, and activists who draw on traditional forms while creating something distinctly contemporary. Sámi culture, evolving in ways that honor the past without being imprisoned by it. The results are sometimes controversial. Traditional purists may object to innovations that seem to dilute or corrupt authentic practices, while others celebrate the creativity and adaptation that keep culture vital rather than merely preserved. These tensions are inevitable and perhaps healthy, signs of a living culture engaged in the necessary work of negotiating between continuity and change. The drums have inspired particular attention in this revival. Several Sámi artists have learned to make drums using traditional techniques, creating instruments that look remarkably like their historical predecessors. But the question of use remains complicated. The shamanic practices associated with the drums were complex and dangerous, requiring years of training under experienced practitioners. That chain of transmission was largely broken, meaning that contemporary drum makers and users are working partly from historical reconstruction, partly from imagination, partly from other shamanic traditions that may or may not be compatible with Sámi practices. What emerges is neither pure tradition nor pure innovation, but something hybrid, a reimagining of the past informed by present needs and sensibilities. Some criticize this reconstruction as inauthentic, a kind of cultural cosplay that mistakes surface resemblance for genuine continuity. Others argue that cultures have always adapted and borrowed, that purity is a myth, that what matters is not perfect historical accuracy, but whether practices serve contemporary needs and maintain meaningful connection to heritage. Both perspectives contain truth, and the tension between them cannot be easily resolved, only navigated by individuals and communities making choices about what they value and how they want to live. The reconstruction of tradition is always an act of interpretation and creativity, never simply recovery of something that existed in pure form, awaiting rediscovery. The landscape continues to be the primary text, the foundation on which everything else rests. For the Sámi, land is not property or resource, but relationship, a living presence that shapes identity and meaning. This understanding has practical implications for contemporary debates about resource extraction, development, and conservation. When mining companies seek to extract minerals from Sámi lands, or when wind farms are proposed in areas sacred to Sámi communities, the conflicts are not merely about economics or even environmental protection, but about fundamentally different understandings of what land is and what obligations humans have to it. The dominant culture sees land instrumentally as means to various ends: economic production, energy generation, recreational space. The Sámi see land relationally as subject rather than object, as something that makes claims on human behavior, rather than simply standing available for human use. These perspectives are difficult to reconcile because they rest on different ontological foundations, different assumptions about the nature of reality and the human place within it. Legal and political systems built on one set of assumptions struggle to accommodate the other, leading to conflicts that cannot be resolved through mere compromise, but that require deeper rethinking of fundamental concepts. In winter, when darkness dominates and the cold reaches intensities that can kill in minutes, the old knowledge remains relevant. The Sámi learn to read weather in ways that meteorological instruments cannot fully replicate. Subtle changes in wind direction, particular qualities of light or cloud formation, animal behavior that signaled approaching storms. This knowledge was transmitted through story and practice, embedded in language and culture, refined across generations. Some of it has been validated by scientific study, found to accord with measurable atmospheric conditions. Other aspects remain mysterious, possibly reflecting patterns too subtle or complex for instruments to detect, possibly involving psychological factors that allow experienced observers to integrate multiple sources of information unconsciously, possibly pointing to dimensions of natural phenomena that science has not yet learned to measure. The validation or invalidation of traditional knowledge by science is not the only or even the primary measure of its value. Much of its worth lies in its integration into cultural practice, its role in maintaining relationship to place and heritage. The stories persist, passed from generation to generation, though their status becomes increasingly ambiguous. Are they myths, metaphors, history, theology, entertainment? The categories themselves are Western impositions. The Sámi did not necessarily distinguish between these functions in the same way. A story could be all of these simultaneously, entertaining and instructive, metaphorically true and historically based, revealing something about the nature of reality, while also encoding practical information about landscape and survival. Some stories explain features of the landscape, why certain mountains have particular shapes, why rivers flow in specific patterns. These etiological tales serve to make the landscape meaningful, to transform it from mere geography into storied space where every feature carries significance. Other stories concern encounters with spirits or supernatural beings, warnings about what can happen when humans transgress boundaries, examples of proper behavior in ambiguous situations, reminders that the world contains more than the visible and measurable. These stories encode wisdom about humility and respect, about the limits of human control, about the need to move carefully through a world where danger can arise unexpectedly. The telling of stories was itself a practice with rules and rhythms. Some stories could be told only at certain times of year, only by certain people, only in certain contexts. This regulation of storytelling served multiple purposes. It created anticipation and specialness. It ensured that stories were heard in appropriate mental and emotional states. It preserved the authority of tradition by preventing casual or careless transmission. The degradation of these regulations, the availability of stories in written form accessible to anyone at any time, represents another kind of loss, not necessarily the stories themselves, but the ceremonial context that gave them particular force and meaning. Memory becomes a sacred duty in cultures that have experienced disruption and loss. To remember is to resist erasure, to maintain connection to ancestors, to preserve knowledge that might otherwise vanish. But memory is also selective and creative, shaped by present needs as much as by past facts. The Sámi past that is remembered and celebrated may differ significantly from the complex historical reality. simplified into narratives that serve contemporary identity formation and political goals. This is not dishonesty, but the inevitable work of memory, which always involves both preservation and transformation, both continuity and creative reconstruction. The past that is remembered is always the past as interpreted by the present, inflected by current concerns and categories, useful for present purposes in ways that pure historical accuracy might not be. The notion of wilderness, so central to how outsiders imagine the Arctic, is itself problematic from a Sámi perspective. What appears to visitors as untouched nature is actually a cultural landscape shaped by centuries of human presence and practice. The reindeer herding patterns influenced vegetation, the seasonal movements created trails, the selective harvesting affected animal populations. The Sámi were not separate from nature, but part of it, their activities integrated into ecological patterns in ways that outsiders often fail to recognize. This has implications for conservation policy, which often aims to exclude human presence from wilderness areas, failing to recognize that such exclusion may actually disrupt ecological patterns that depend on traditional human activities. The Sámi offer an alternative model, not separation of human and natural, but integration, not preservation of pristine wilderness, but maintenance of relationships that have shaped landscapes for generations. As the text approaches its conclusion, the circularity becomes apparent. We return to snow and ice, to darkness and light, to mysteries that remain mysterious not from lack of investigation, but from their essential nature. The Sámi understanding does not resolve these mysteries, but rather offers a way of living with them, of accepting ambiguity without surrendering to either credulous acceptance or dismissive skepticism. In the end, perhaps what the Sámi have to teach is not specific beliefs or practices. These belong to their culture and cannot simply be borrowed or adopted by others, but rather an approach, a way of being in relationship with mystery, land, heritage. This approach combines practicality with reverence, adaptation with preservation, openness with discernment. It acknowledges that some knowledge is propositional, transmissible through language and analysis, while other knowledge is experiential, accessible only through direct engagement and practice. It recognizes that cultures are neither static museums nor infinitely plastic, but rather living systems that maintain identity through constant negotiation between continuity and change. The Arctic night deepens, the stars wheel overhead, in patterns the Sámi learn to read for navigation and meaning. The aurora flickers and dances, beautiful and uncanny, manifestation of forces that science can explain mechanistically, but whose experiential impact exceeds any explanation. The joyous sounds in the darkness, each one unique, each one somehow capturing in organized sound something essential about its subject that could not be expressed any other way. And somewhere perhaps a drum remains hidden, preserved by a family that recognized its value and refused to surrender it, waiting for a time when it might be used again, when the knowledge required to interpret its symbols might be recovered or recreated. The snow continues its eternal work, covering and revealing, preserving and erasing. It buries artifacts that archaeologists will discover centuries hence, raising new questions even as it provides new evidence. It covers tracks, making the landscape appear empty of human presence, while the Sámi continue their relationship with land that extends back beyond memory into the depths of time where history and myth become indistinguishable. This snow does not discriminate between important and trivial, between sacred and mundane, treating all with the same patient accumulation, the same inevitable melt and reformation. The mysteries of Sámi culture endure not as problems awaiting solution, but as invitations to a different kind of knowing, one that acknowledges uncertainty, respects the limits of explanation, remains open to experiences that exceed conceptual frameworks. In a world increasingly characterized by confident assertions of certainty, whether from science or religion or politics, This epistemological humility offers an alternative, a reminder that mystery is not ignorance, but rather recognition of complexity that exceeds our current understanding. To stand in the Arctic landscape is to feel simultaneously insignificant and connected, diminished by the vast scale and harsh conditions, yet part of something larger than individual existence. This double awareness of human smallness and human belonging shaped Sámi consciousness and practice, creating a culture that maintained dignity without grandiosity, that respected both human capability and its limits. The drums are silent in their museum cases, but their silence speaks. It reminds us of what has been lost, but also of what persists, the human impulse toward meaning, toward connection with forces larger than ourselves, toward practices that acknowledge dimensions of existence invisible to ordinary perception. Whether those dimensions exist objectively or arise from psychological and cultural processes matters less than the fact that attention to them produces effects, shapes experience, creates possibilities that pure materialism forecloses. The Sámi understood this pragmatically, caring more about what worked than about metaphysical purity, maintaining practices that served their needs, regardless of whether those practices could be justified through the categories of Western philosophy or science. And so the story ends where it began, in snow and ice, in ambiguity and mystery, in the space between material and spiritual, where the Sámi lived and continue to live. No conclusions are drawn because the Sámi experience resists conclusion, remains open and unfinished, continuing to unfold as new generations take up the work of maintaining culture in changing circumstances. The northern lights dance overhead, indifferent to human interpretation, following patterns determined by solar wind and magnetic fields, yet appearing somehow intentional, somehow aware. Perhaps they are both, natural phenomena and spiritual presence, explained by physics and exceeding that explanation, demonstrating that the modern divide between material and spiritual is itself a cultural construction, not a universal truth. The wind blows across the tundra, carrying snow that will fall and melt and fall again in cycles that have repeated since the last ice age. The land endures, patient and powerful, shaped by geology and climate, but also by human presence, by countless acts of naming and story and ritual that have transformed mere space into place, into home, into the foundation of culture and identity. The Sámi remain, carrying forward their heritage not as static tradition, but as living practice, adapting to modernity while maintaining essential connections to land and language and ancestors. Their persistence testifies to cultural resilience, to the human capacity to maintain identity through adversity, to refuse erasure even when powerful forces work toward that end. In their persistence lies a teaching for anyone willing to listen that cultures can adapt without losing themselves, that modernity and tradition need not be opposed, that the past can inform the present without imprisoning it. This teaching arrives not through explicit instruction, but through example, through the ongoing work of living, of maintaining relationship, of negotiating daily between what was and what is and what might be. The text reaches its end, but the story continues, written in lives rather than words, in practices that adapt and endure, in the patient work of each generation to receive what the past offers and pass forward what the future requires. The mysteries remain mysterious, the questions unanswered, the landscape still teaching those who know how to listen, and that perhaps is exactly as it should be. In a culture where survival was communal and hardship was shared, wealth nevertheless existed, and with wealth came distinctions that shaped social dynamics in ways both subtle and significant. The Sámi had no formal class system, no hereditary nobility, no titles passed from parent to child, but they were not egalitarian in the naive sense that word sometimes implies. Wealth among the Sámi was measured primarily in reindeer. A family with 300 animals lived very differently from a family with 30, and the differences extended beyond mere comfort into the realm of security, influence, and future possibility. The wealthy herder, and let us be clear that wealthy here means something modest by almost any other standard, did not live in luxury. There were no mansions in the tundra, no servants, no leisure class that avoided physical labor. Everyone worked, everyone endured the cold, everyone participated in the daily struggle of survival. But work feels different when you know your family will eat regardless of this season's challenges. Labor is less desperate when you have a cushion of animals that can be slaughtered in emergency, traded for supplies, used to recover from misfortune that would destroy a poorer family. The wealthy herder's lavu might be slightly larger, the hides slightly thicker, the tools slightly better maintained, because there were more resources available for their care. These differences were not dramatic. No one was building monuments or displaying ostentation, but they were real and visible to everyone in the community. More significant than material comfort was the psychological dimension of wealth. The wealthy herder slept more easily, worried less constantly, faced each winter with anxiety rather than terror. Poverty in Sámi culture meant being one disaster away from catastrophe. A single harsh winter, a single wolf attack that scattered the herd, a single illness at the wrong time, any of these could reduce a poor family to destitution, forcing them to depend on the charity of others or to split up, children sent to live with relatives, the elderly left to die because the young could not support them. Wealth provided buffer against these catastrophes, not immunity. No one was immune to the North's cruelty, but resilience, the ability to absorb shocks that would destroy others. This resilience translated into influence. When decisions needed to be made about migration timing or routes, the voices that carried most weight were often those of herders whose judgment had been proven by survival, whose success suggested either wisdom or luck, or both. The wealthy herder was listened to not because of formal authority, but because their wealth demonstrated competence. They had managed to accumulate and maintain a large herd, which required skill in grazing management, predator protection, breeding decisions, and countless other areas of knowledge. Of course, luck played a role too. A family might become wealthy through inheritance, receiving animals from childless relatives or from strategic marriages that merged herds. But luck alone could not maintain wealth. Poor management would quickly dissipate even a large inheritance. So wealth and competence were closely linked in Sámi understanding, though not perfectly. Everyone knew of wealthy families whose success was largely inherited, and of poor families whose poverty resulted from misfortune rather than incompetence. But the general correlation was strong enough that wealth carried presumptive authority, the assumption that someone who had succeeded materially probably had knowledge worth respecting. This dynamic created social stratification without formal hierarchy. The wealthy formed a sort of informal council, making decisions collectively but with their voices carrying disproportionate weight. Poor families resented this sometimes quietly, seeing in the wealthy's influence an unfairness that contradicted the communal ethic that supposedly governed Sámi life. But resentment was rarely expressed openly, partly because direct conflict was dangerous in a survival-dependent community, partly because the resentment itself was ambivalent. After all, the wealthy also bore responsibilities. Their resources were expected to be available during emergencies. When a poor family lost their herd, when starvation threatened, when disaster struck, the wealthy were expected to share, to provide animals for slaughter, to ensure that no one died when death could be prevented. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was obligation, a recognized duty that came with wealth and that everyone understood, even if it was rarely articulated explicitly. The wealthy who hoarded, who refused to share during crisis, who prioritized their own accumulation over community survival, These people lost their influence rapidly. Wealth without generosity was worthless in social terms, converting material advantage into isolation and resentment. So the wealthy walked a narrow path, balancing accumulation and distribution, self-interest and communal responsibility, enjoying advantages while bearing expectations that those advantages entailed. The children of wealthy families grew up differently from poor children. They were not exempt from work. Everyone worked, but their work carried different emotional weight. A wealthy child learning to manage reindeer knew that mistakes would not mean starvation. This freedom from desperation allowed for experimentation, for learning through trial and error, for developing skills without the constant pressure of immediate survival. Poor children learned under harsher conditions, where errors could have severe consequences, where innovation was dangerous because the margin for failure was so slim. Over time, this difference in learning conditions created a competence gap that reinforced wealth inequality. The wealthy became more skilled not because of innate superiority, but because they could afford to learn properly. Marriage patterns reflected and reinforced these dynamics. Wealthy families tended to intermarry, merging herds, consolidating resources, creating networks of mutual support that were difficult for poor families to access. These marriages were not arranged in the coercive sense. The Sámi valued compatibility and mutual respect, but they were strategic, with parents gently steering children toward matches that made economic sense. A poor young man seeking to marry a wealthy young woman faced obstacles that were never explicitly stated, but that were nevertheless real. Her family would question whether he could provide adequately, whether combining herds would strengthen or weaken their position, whether the match represented opportunity or risk. Sometimes love overcame these calculations. Sometimes poor but capable young people married into wealth and justified their family's faith in them. But more often, wealth married wealth and poverty married poverty, and the social structure reproduced itself generation after generation. The wealthy also had different relationships with the spiritual dimensions of Sámi culture. They were more likely to sponsor rituals, to provide animals for sacrifice, to support the noaidi through gifts and resources. This sponsorship created a complex relationship between material and spiritual power. The noaidi needed the wealthy's support to maintain their practice, which gave the wealthy indirect influence over spiritual matters. But the noaidi also possessed authority that was independent of wealth, based on their special knowledge and abilities, which limited the wealthy's control. Sometimes these power centers aligned, wealthy herders and noaidi working together, spiritual and material authority reinforcing each other. Sometimes they conflicted, the noaidi challenging decisions made by the wealthy or the wealthy questioning the noaidi's judgment. These conflicts were subtle, rarely erupting into open dispute, but they shaped community dynamics in important ways, creating checks and balances that prevented either group from becoming too dominant. The arrival of external forces, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and Russian colonizers, disrupted these internal dynamics dramatically. The colonizers imposed tax systems that recognized some Sámi as authorities, giving them responsibility for collecting tribute from others. This transformation was profound. What had been informal influence became formal power, backed by state violence, enforced through mechanisms that bore no relationship to traditional Sámi governance. Some wealthy Sámi collaborated with colonizers, accepting appointed positions, using external authority to enhance their local power. This collaboration was pragmatic. The colonizers were going to impose their systems regardless, so working with them at least provided some influence over how those systems functioned. But collaboration came with costs, loss of legitimacy in the eyes of other Sámi, participation in systems that undermined traditional culture, moral compromise that corroded self-respect and community trust. Other wealthy Sámi resisted, refusing to cooperate, maintaining traditional practices despite pressure and punishment. This resistance was principled but costly, resulting in poverty, persecution, sometimes death. The majority occupied a middle ground, complying when necessary, resisting when possible, trying to navigate between competing demands and loyalties. These colonial dynamics revealed both the strength and fragility of Sámi social structure. The informal nature of Sámi authority, its basis in demonstrated competence and communal agreement rather than formal power, made it flexible and adaptive, but also vulnerable to external systems that operated on completely different principles. Wealth in traditional Sámi culture had been constrained by obligation and community oversight. In the colonial context, wealth could be weaponized, used to exploit rather than support, freed from the ethical constraints that had previously limited its concentration and abuse. Some wealthy Sámi accumulated resources on scales previously impossible, becoming intermediaries between communities and colonial powers, enriching themselves through a combination of traditional herding and modern trade. These newly wealthy occupied an ambiguous position, admired for their success, resented for their collaboration, envied for their resources, scorned for their abandonment of traditional values. The poor, meanwhile, became poorer, squeezed by taxation, pushed off traditional lands, forced into wage labor or dependence on state welfare, losing not just material security, but also the dignity that came from self-sufficiency and participation in meaningful work. By the 20th century, the traditional Sámi social structure had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Wealth still mattered, but it functioned differently, embedded in market economies and state bureaucracies rather than reciprocal relationships and communal obligations. Some Sámi adapted successfully to these changes, maintaining herds while also participating in modern economies, sending children to schools, learning to navigate legal systems that governed land use and resource access. Others were left behind, losing their herds, losing their language, losing connection to the cultural practices that had defined Sámi identity for generations. Today, wealth among the Sámi, for those who still herd reindeer, is measured in ways that would be recognizable to their ancestors. The size and health of the herd remains paramount. But it is also measured in modern terms: access to snowmobiles and trucks and GPS systems, ability to navigate government regulations and secure subsidies, possession of education and connections that provide advantages in dealing with the complex bureaucracy that now governs what was once managed through communal consensus. The psychological dimension of wealth persists. Those with large herds still sleep easier, still face winters with anxiety rather than terror. The poor still live one disaster away from catastrophe, though now the disaster might be economic rather than environmental, might take the form of debt or regulatory violation rather than wolf attack or harsh winter. And the social dynamics persist too, transformed but recognizable. The wealthy still have more influence, still make decisions that affect others, still bear responsibilities for communal welfare, though those responsibilities are now less clearly defined and less reliably enforced. What has changed most is the moral framework. Traditional Sámi culture embedded wealth in a web of obligations and expectations that limited its concentration and abuse. Modern systems lack these constraints or replace them with bureaucratic regulations that function differently, that can be evaded or manipulated, that create new forms of inequality without the compensating mechanisms of communal oversight. The result is a Sámi society that is more stratified, more unequal, more divided between wealthy and poor than at any time in its history, not because the Sámi have changed fundamentally, but because the systems within which they operate have changed, imposing new rules that produce different outcomes. In the deep winter darkness, a wealthy herder might still wake in a lavu, surrounded by reindeer hides, listening to wind. But outside that tent, the world has transformed. The isolation that once protected Sámi culture has been breached. The communal practices that once governed resource distribution have been replaced by market mechanisms and state regulations. And the quiet understanding that wealth entailed responsibility, that accumulation without distribution was morally bankrupt, that community survival mattered more than individual enrichment, This understanding survives primarily as nostalgia, as story, as a half-remembered way of organizing social life that seems increasingly distant and difficult to sustain. The reindeer still move through the snow, the wealthy still own most of them, the poor still struggle. But the meaning of these facts has shifted, embedded now in a global economic system that cares nothing for traditional Sámi values, that rewards accumulation without limit, that converts everything, land, animals, culture, identity itself, into commodities to be bought and sold. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of colonization, not just the loss of land or resources, but the loss of the moral frameworks that gave meaning to material life, that embedded wealth in relationship and obligation, that made prosperity something to be shared rather than hoarded. The snow continues to fall, indifferent to human arrangements. The wind blows, erasing distinctions between rich and poor, powerful and powerless. In nature's accounting, all are equal, but in human society, equality has never been simple, and perhaps never will be. The darkness is deepest just before the light returns. This is true astronomically, the winter solstice marks the point of longest night, but it is also true psychologically, spiritually, in the lived experience of people who endure extended darkness. The Sámi understood this rhythm. They knew that winter's harshest moment contained within it the promise of its own ending, that even as the cold deepened and the darkness felt eternal, the world was already turning towards spring, imperceptibly but inevitably. This understanding required patience beyond what most modern people can imagine. We live in a culture of instant gratification, of impatience with any delay, of constant stimulation and immediate response. The idea of waiting months for conditions to improve, of enduring discomfort without complaint because complaint changes nothing, of accepting that some things simply take time, these ideas feel almost alien to contemporary consciousness. But the Sámi had no choice except patience. They could not make the sun return faster. They could not will spring into existence. They could only endure, day after day, maintaining the routines that kept them alive, trusting that the cycles that had always turned would turn again. Looking back across the vast distance between their world and ours, we might feel admiration for their resilience, pity for their hardship, curiosity about their beliefs and practices. But we should also feel something like recognition. These were people fundamentally like us, with the same basic needs and fears and hopes, responding to different circumstances but with the same human qualities of adaptability and endurance. They were not more virtuous than we are. They had the same capacity for pettiness, cruelty, selfishness that characterizes all human communities, but their circumstances demanded certain virtues: patience, cooperation, humility before nature's power. And they cultivated these virtues because survival required it. What would it mean to cultivate similar virtues in our very different context? We do not face the same physical challenges. Our buildings are heated, our food supply is secure, our lives are not measured by the rhythm of reindeer migrations and seasonal changes. But we face our own forms of darkness, our own long winters of uncertainty and difficulty. And perhaps the Sámi example offers something useful, not specific practices to be imitated, but a general orientation toward endurance, patience, acceptance of what cannot be changed while working steadily on what can. The modern world moves quickly, sometimes too quickly, racing forward without pausing to consider direction or purpose. The Sámi world moved slowly, sometimes oppressively slowly, each day blending into the next in a rhythm that seemed endless. Perhaps what we need is something between these extremes, the ability to move deliberately without rushing, to endure difficulty without becoming numb to it, to maintain hope without requiring constant evidence that hope is justified. As you settle towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can carry something of the Sámi patience with you. You are not enduring a literal winter. You are warm, comfortable, safe in ways they could hardly have imagined. But you may be enduring other difficulties, other forms of darkness that feel endless even though they are temporary. The Sámi teach us that darkness ends, not quickly, not on our preferred schedule, but inevitably. The sun returns, the snow melts, life continues, and in the meantime, there is something valuable in the waiting itself, in the patience that accepts present difficulty while trusting future improvement, in the quiet endurance that does not require heroics, only consistency. Your breathing is slowing now, your body is settling into rest. The modern world, with its noise and light and constant demand for attention, is fading, becoming distant. You are in the quiet now, in the space between waking and sleeping, between day and tomorrow, between who you are and who you will become with morning's light. The Sámi spent months in this liminal space, waiting for spring, enduring winter's darkness. You spend only hours moving through night toward dawn. But the principle is the same. Trust that darkness ends, that light returns, that the world's great cycles continue regardless of your worry or impatience. Let yourself drift now. Let the stories dissolve. Let the weight of history settle around you, not as burden, but as comfort, as reminder that countless people have faced harder challenges than you face, have endured greater darkness, and emerged into light. The reindeer are sleeping in the snow, the wind has quieted, the northern lights shimmer silently across the sky, and you, comfortable and warm, can rest easily, carrying with you the knowledge that resilience is not about never struggling, but about continuing despite struggle, about waking each day to face what must be faced, about moving forward, not because the path is clear, but because forward is the only direction that leads anywhere. Sleep now. The darkness is patient. The light will return.